The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the parched Wyoming Territory as Lillian Turner stood ankle-deep in freshly dug soil, her husband's coffin disappearing beneath the unforgiving earth that had claimed him just as suddenly as the fever. Her fingers clutched a worn handkerchief, knuckles white with grief and exhaustion as the preacher's final words faded into the wind. Wyoming Territory, 1879. A place where fortunes were made and broken on the turn of a season, where men measured wealth in acres and cattle, and where a woman alone was as vulnerable as a newborn calf during a snowstorm. Mrs. Turner. Vernon Blackwell, her father-in-law, approached with his 3 remaining sons flanking him like a human fortress. The family patriarch's face, weathered by decades under the western sun, showed no trace of the tears one might expect at a son's burial. The funeral expenses have been settled. Lillian nodded, unable to form words through the tightness in her throat. 4 months married to Thomas Turner, and now she stood a widow at 23, miles from her childhood home in Pennsylvania, surrounded by in-laws who had barely masked their disapproval of their son's Eastern bride. "We've discussed the matter of your situation," Vernon continued, his voice as dry as the surrounding plains. "The Turner homestead belongs to this family. It was never properly deeded to Thomas, as I'm certain you're aware." Lillian blinked, confusion momentarily overtaking her grief. "I don't understand. It's simple enough, girl." Vernon's eldest son, Elias, stepped forward. "You'll need to make arrangements. The house and land remain with the Turners." "But I am a Turner," Lillian said, her voice gaining strength despite the trembling in her limbs. Vernon's face hardened. "You were Thomas's mistake, a mail-order bride he sent for without family blessing. No Turner blood runs in your veins." The words struck Lillian like physical blows. She staggered back, grateful for the steadying hand of the preacher's wife behind her. "You have 1 week to collect your belongings and vacate the property," Vernon declared. "We'll be generous enough to provide the wagon fare back to wherever you came from." With that pronouncement, the Turner men turned in unison, leaving Lillian alone by the fresh grave save for the preacher and his wife, whose pitying glances felt almost as unbearable as the Turners' coldness. 3 days later, Lillian stood in the small cabin she had briefly called home, packing the few possessions that were undeniably hers. The Turners had wasted no time inventorying everything, claiming nearly all furniture, cookware, and tools as family property. Even Thomas's clothes had been collected, though what use Vernon's hulking sons would have for their slender brother's garments remained a mystery. A knock at the door startled her. Visitors had been scarce since the funeral, the neighboring homesteaders seemingly unsure how to treat the widow who was no longer welcome among the influential Turner clan. Lillian opened the door to find Mrs. Peterson, an elderly neighbor who lived 3 miles east with her son's family. "I've brought some bread," the woman said, pressing a cloth-wrapped loaf into Lillian's hands. "Heard what those Turners are doing. Shameful business, though not unexpected from that lot." "Thank you," Lillian managed, inviting the woman inside to the nearly empty cabin. Mrs. Peterson surveyed the bare walls and packed trunks. "Where will you go, child?" Lillian sank onto her trunk, the only remaining seat in the room. "I have enough saved for passage back to Pennsylvania, but—" She hesitated, the thought of returning home in disgrace overwhelming her. Her family had celebrated her marriage as a triumph, their daughter becoming a landowner's wife in the promising Western Territories. "Seems a waste," Mrs. Peterson said, settling her substantial frame against the edge of the table. "You've got pioneer spirit, anyone can see that." "Sending you back east like damaged goods isn't right," Lillian smiled weakly. "I don't have many options." "Well," Mrs. Peterson said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "there might be one you haven't considered. Jackson Keller's place borders the northern edge of what was to be yours. Man's been working that land alone since his father passed 3 years back. Built it up nice, 2 good herds, sturdy house, keeps to himself mostly, but he's respected, honest. Mrs. Peterson, I've barely been widowed a week. I'm hardly looking for, not suggesting romance, girl." The older woman clucked her tongue. "Suggesting survival. Jackson needs a cook and housekeeper, been managing on his own, but bachelor living doesn't suit a man of his means. You need a roof that can't be yanked from over your head. Might be an arrangement could benefit you both. Work as his housekeeper. Lillian considered the idea. It would keep her in the territory, allow her time to heal and plan her future. Worth asking. I can mention it if you'd like. Lillian nodded slowly. Yes, please do. 2 days later, as Lillian was folding the last of her dresses into her trunk, the sound of hoofbeats approached the cabin. Peering through the window, she saw a tall man dismounting from a chestnut mare. His broad shoulders and straight posture gave him a commanding presence, though he removed his hat and held it respectfully as he approached the door. When Lillian opened it, she found herself looking up at a man perhaps a few years shy of 30, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the precise color of a summer sky before a storm. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, though a bit overgrown at the nape of his neck. "Mrs. Turner?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. "I'm Jackson Keller. Mrs. Peterson mentioned you might be in need of a position." Lillian straightened, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance after a morning of packing. "Mr. Keller, yes, please come in." She gestured to the barren room. "I'm afraid I can't offer you a seat." Jackson stepped inside, surveying the stripped cabin with a frown. "The Turners didn't leave much." "They're very thorough," Lillian replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Jackson nodded, turning his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Peterson spoke highly of your character, said you kept a fine home for Thomas, despite having little time to settle in." "Thomas and I were only married 4 months before the fever took him," Lillian explained. "But yes, I manage the household. I can cook, clean, mend, and keep accounts. My father was a shopkeeper in Pennsylvania." "I'm not looking for references, Mrs. Turner," Jackson said with a slight smile, "but I am looking for help. My place is larger than I need 4 rooms plus a kitchen. The previous housekeeper left to care for her ailing mother in Denver last winter, and I've been managing poorly ever since." Lillian hesitated. "And what would this position entail exactly?" "Room and board, of course. A private bedroom, weekly wages of $2. In exchange, you'd manage the household cooking, cleaning, mending. I've 3 ranch hands who take their midday meal at the bunkhouse, but breakfast and supper are served at the main house." It was a fair offer, better than fair, considering her circumstances. Still, Lillian had concerns. "And my reputation, Mr. Keller? A young widow living under the roof of an unmarried man." Jackson's expression remained serious. "I've thought of that. My nearest neighbor is 2 miles away, but gossip travels faster than wind in these parts. I'd have Mrs. Peterson visit regularly, perhaps stay over when I'm away on business. And I'd make it clear to anyone who asked that you're my employee, nothing more." Lillian considered the alternative, returning to her parents' modest home, enduring the pitying glances of former friends, becoming the cautionary tale of the girl who went west and returned with nothing. "When would you need me to start?" "Today, if possible," Jackson said. "I've brought the wagon for your things." Lillian glanced around the cabin one last time. There was nothing left of her brief marriage here. The Turners had seen to that. "Very well, Mr. Keller, I accept your offer." The journey to Jackson Keller's ranch took just over an hour, following a winding trail that skirted the edge of Turner property before climbing into more rugged terrain. As they crested a hill, Lillian caught her first glimpse of her new home, a substantial 2-story house built of solid timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. A large barn stood nearby, alongside several smaller outbuildings, and in the distance, cattle grazed on rolling grassland that stretched toward distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Lillian murmured, genuinely impressed. Jackson's expression softened with pride. "My father started with nothing but a claim and 20 head of cattle. Took him 15 years to build this place. I've added the north pasture and the new barn since he passed." The wagon rolled into the yard, and a lean man with a weathered face emerged from the barn. "That's Seth," Jackson explained. "Foreman, been with us since I was a boy. The other hands are probably out with the herd." Seth approached, nodding respectfully to Lillian. "Mrs. Turner, welcome to Keller Ranch." "Thank you," Lillian replied, touched by the simple courtesy after days of the Turners' coldness. Jackson helped Lillian down from the wagon, then carried her trunks into the house while Seth took the team to the barn. Inside, Lillian found a home that reflected prosperity but clearly lacked a woman's touch. The furniture was substantial and well-made, but dust had accumulated on surfaces and the curtains hung unevenly at the windows. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right," Jackson said, setting down her trunk in the entryway. "Mine is at the opposite end of the hall. The other rooms are unused, though I keep one as an office." Lillian followed him upstairs, taking in her surroundings. The room he led her to was larger than she expected, with a comfortable-looking bed, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk beneath a window that overlooked the eastern pasture. "Will this suit?" Jackson asked, placing her trunk at the foot of the bed. "It's more than adequate," Lillian assured him. "Thank you." Jackson lingered in the doorway. "I'll leave you to settle in. Supper is usually at 6, but given the circumstances, perhaps something simple tonight would be best." "I'll manage a proper meal, Mr. Keller," Lillian said firmly. "It's why you've hired me, after all." A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "As you wish, Mrs. Turner. The kitchen is well stocked. I make a trip to town every other week for supplies." After he left, Lillian sank onto the edge of the bed, allowing herself a moment of quiet contemplation. In the span of a week, she had lost her husband, her home, and now found herself essentially starting over as a housekeeper for a man she barely knew. Yet somehow, in this quiet room with its clean linens and solid walls, she felt her first glimmer of hope since Thomas's death. By supper time, Lillian had unpacked her belongings, scrubbed the kitchen to her satisfaction, and prepared a meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread that she'd found in the well-stocked pantry. The routine of cooking had calmed her nerves, giving her purpose after days of uncertainty. Jackson entered the kitchen precisely at 6, having clearly washed up for the meal. His hair was damp at the temples, and he'd changed into a clean shirt. He paused in the doorway, inhaling appreciatively. "Something smells wonderful." "Just simple fare," Lillian said, placing a steaming platter on the table. "I'll become more familiar with your preferences as time goes on." They ate mostly in silence, though not uncomfortably so. Jackson had impeccable table manners for a man who had lived alone for so long, and Lillian found herself grateful for his lack of prying questions about her circumstances. As she cleared the plates, Jackson finally spoke. "I want you to know that I'm sorry about Thomas. He was always decent to me, unlike some of his kin." Lillian paused, a plate in her hand. "Thank you, he was a good man. We had so little time together, but what we had was kind." Jackson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The Turners have a way of taking what isn't theirs, always have. My father and old Vernon had their share of boundary disputes over the years. They claimed Thomas never legally owned the homestead," Lillian said, resuming her task. "Convenient for them," Jackson replied, a edge to his voice. "Thomas told me differently last fall. Said his father had finally signed over the deed as a wedding gift." Lillian's hands stilled. "He told me the same, but I never saw the papers. Vernon insisted no such document existed." "Vernon Blackwell is not a man whose word I'd trust," Jackson said simply. "But without proof, there's little to be done." That night, lying in her new bed, Lillian tried to reconcile her grief with her changing circumstances. Thomas seemed increasingly distant in her memory. Their brief marriage now felt like a dream from which she'd been abruptly awakened. The reality was this house, this job, and the quiet, serious man down the hall who had offered her refuge when she needed it most. The days quickly fell into a routine. Lillian rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Jackson and any hands who were eating at the main house. Mornings were spent cleaning and baking, afternoons devoted to mending, laundry, or preserving garden produce. By the end of her first week, the house had been transformed. Curtains hung straight, floors gleamed, and meals appeared on the table with dependable regularity. Jackson said little, but his appreciation was evident in the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he entered the freshly cleaned parlor, or how he lingered longer at the dinner table each evening. Slowly, They began to converse more freely, Jackson sharing stories of cattle drives and the history of the territory. Lillian occasionally speaking of her life in Pennsylvania. On Sunday morning, Lillian was surprised when Jackson appeared at breakfast, wearing his good suit. "Church is 10 miles south," he explained, noting her questioning look. "I thought you might wish to attend. The wagon's ready whenever you are." Touched by his consideration, Lillian hurried to change into her best dress, a navy blue wool that had somehow escaped the Turners' inventory. Within the hour, they were on the road, the spring sunshine warming the air around them. "I should warn you," Jackson said as they approached the small white clapboard church. "The Turners attend here as well." Lillian's stomach tightened. "Perhaps this isn't wise. You have every right to worship," Jackson interrupted firmly. "And every right to hold your head high. I'll be beside you." His quiet confidence steadied her, and Lillian managed to walk into the church with dignity despite the whispers that followed their entrance. They sat in a pew near the back, and throughout the service, Lillian was conscious of the sideways glances from the congregation. When the final hymn concluded, Lillian steeled herself for the inevitable confrontation. It came as they exited the church, Vernon Blackwell positioning himself directly in their path. "Mrs. Turner," he said coldly, his gaze flicking to Jackson. "I see you found alternative arrangements." Before Lillian could respond, Jackson stepped slightly forward. "Mrs. Turner is employed as my housekeeper, Blackwell. A fortunate circumstance for my household, considering the unconscionable way your family has treated a grieving widow." Vernon's eyes narrowed. "Our family business is no concern of yours, Keller. When it involves turning a woman out of her rightful home, perhaps it should be everyone's concern," Jackson replied evenly. A small crowd had gathered, including the preacher who looked decidedly uncomfortable. Vernon seemed to realize the public nature of the confrontation and took a step back. "Mrs. Turner was welcome to return to her people. We even offered wagon fare." "How magnanimous," Jackson said, his tone making the word an insult. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a long ride home." He placed a gentle hand at Lillian's elbow, guiding her past the Turners and toward their wagon. Only when they were on the road did Lillian release the breath she'd been holding. "I apologize if I spoke out of turn," Jackson said after they'd traveled some distance in silence. "No," Lillian replied, finding her voice at last. "Thank you for defending me." Few would have faced down Vernon Blackwell so directly. Jackson's hands tightened on the reins. "That man has bullied his neighbors for 20 years. Someone should have stood up to him long before now." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Lillian felt a shift in her relationship with Jackson. No longer merely employer and employee, they had become allies against a common adversary. It was a small change, but significant. "Will you tell me about Thomas?" Jackson asked suddenly, breaking the companionable silence, "if it's not too painful to speak of him." Lillian considered the request, surprised to find that the sharp edge of grief had begun to dull. "We met through correspondence. My father's store had failed and our family was struggling. A friend suggested I consider becoming a mail-order bride. Thomas's letter was kind, educated. He described Wyoming as a place of opportunity. And when you arrived." He was exactly as his letters had portrayed, gentle, somewhat scholarly for a rancher. "The Turners disapproved immediately, of course, called me a city girl, though Pennsylvania's countryside is hardly a metropolis." Lillian smiled faintly at the memory. "We were happy, I think, in our brief time." "Still learning each other when the fever came." Jackson nodded slowly. "He spoke of you, you know. We weren't close friends, but we'd cross paths in town occasionally. He seemed proud to have won you." Lillian blinked back unexpected tears. "Thank you for telling me that." As spring warmed into summer, the rhythm of ranch life intensified. Jackson and his men were constantly busy with the herd, repairing fences and preparing for the fall cattle drive. Lillian expanded her duties to include tending a vegetable garden and helping with the milk cows. Her city-bred hands grew calloused, her skin tanned by the Wyoming sun, and she discovered muscles she never knew existed. On a particularly hot July afternoon, Lillian was hanging laundry when she noticed a cloud of dust on the road from town. Shielding her eyes, she made out a single rider approaching at a brisk pace. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Elias Turner, Vernon's eldest son. Jackson was out checking the north pasture with Seth, leaving Lillian alone at the house. For a moment, she considered retreating inside, but pride kept her at the clothesline, determinedly pinning a sheet as Elias reined his horse to a stop in the yard. "Mrs. Turner," he called, not bothering to dismount. "I've a message from my father." Lillian pinned the final corner of the sheet before turning to face him. "Mr. Turner, Father says he's found some papers belonging to Thomas that you might want, personal effects." Elias's expression remained impassive. "He's willing to hand them over provided you come to collect them yourself." Suspicion flared in Lillian's mind. "What sort of papers?" "I wouldn't know," Elias replied with exaggerated indifference. "Father handles the family affairs. Said to tell you he'll be home tomorrow afternoon if you're interested." With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving Lillian staring after him with a mixture of confusion and unease. When Jackson returned that evening, she told him about Elias's visit. "It's a trap of some kind," Jackson said immediately, his brow furrowing. "Vernon doesn't give anything without getting something in return. But what if it's the deed?" Lillian paced the kitchen, hands twisting her apron. "What if Thomas really did have legal ownership of the homestead?" Jackson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Even if it is, what would you do? Move back to the Turner homestead alone?" "It's not about moving back," Lillian explained. "It's about what's rightfully mine. If Thomas owned that land, then I'm his widow and legal heir. The property should be mine to sell if I choose." Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes. "And a property sale would give you independence, funds of your own." "Exactly." Lillian stopped pacing and faced him directly. "I value the position you've given me, Mr. Keller, but no one wishes to be dependent forever," he finished for her. "I understand completely, and I respect your desire for self-sufficiency." He thought for a moment. "If you're determined to go, I'll accompany you." "That's not necessary. It absolutely is," Jackson said firmly. "Vernon won't try anything with a witness present, especially one who's known to have a good relationship with the sheriff." The next afternoon found them riding toward the Turner ranch. Jackson on his mare and Lillian on a gentle gelding she'd learned to ride during her time at Keller Ranch. As they approached the sprawling Blackwell property, Lillian felt a strange mixture of emotions: anger at how she'd been treated, grief for the life with Thomas that had been cut short, and an odd nostalgia for the brief time she'd called this place home. Vernon was waiting on the porch, his expression souring when he saw Jackson accompanying Lillian. "This is a family matter, Keller," he called as they dismounted. "Mrs. Turner asked me to accompany her," Jackson replied calmly. "Given your family's previous treatment of her, I considered it prudent." Vernon's mouth thinned to a hard line, but he gestured them inside. The house was much as Lillian remembered, ostentatiously furnished, with hunting trophies adorning every wall. They followed Vernon into his study, where he retrieved a small wooden box from a cabinet. "Found these among Thomas's things after you left," he said, placing the box on his desk. "Thought you might want them, being personal items and such." Lillian approached cautiously and opened the box. Inside were a few letters she had written to Thomas before their marriage, a small daguerreotype of herself that she'd sent with her acceptance of his proposal, and a folded document that made her heart race. She carefully unfolded the paper, confirming her suspicion it was indeed a deed transferring ownership of the Turner homestead from Vernon to Thomas, dated 1 week before her arrival in Wyoming. "This is a legal deed of transfer," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "It proves Thomas owned the property." Vernon shrugged. "Perhaps, but there's a problem with that particular document, Mrs. Turner. It was never filed with the county clerk. Legally speaking, that land has always remained Turner property." Jackson stepped forward, examining the document over Lillian's shoulder. "The signatures appear legal. 2 witnesses." Witnesses who would testify the document was merely a draft, never intended for filing, Vernon countered smugly. I was considering transferring the property to Thomas eventually, but his hasty marriage and untimely death changed matters. Lillian fought to control her rising anger. So you deliberately withheld this document when you forced me from my home. I didn't force you from anywhere, Vernon said, his voice hardening. I simply clarified ownership of family property, and now I've returned your personal effects out of the goodness of my heart. I'd think you'd show some gratitude. Jackson's hand came to rest at the small of Lillian's back, a silent reminder of his support. We should take this to Judge Patterson, he suggested quietly. He could advise on its legality. Vernon's expression darkened. That won't be necessary. I've already consulted the judge myself. He confirmed what I've told you without proper filing. The deed is merely a piece of paper. Now, if there's nothing else. Lillian carefully replaced the letters and photograph in the box, but kept the deed in her hand. I'll be taking this with me. By all means, Vernon said with a dismissive wave. It's worthless anyway. The ride back to Keller Ranch was mostly silent, both Lillian and Jackson lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were unsaddling the horses that Jackson finally spoke. Vernon's lying about the judge, he said, removing his mare's bridle. Patterson is in Denver until next month. There's no way Vernon consulted him. Lillian paused, her hands stilling on the gelding saddle straps. You're sure? Positive. The whole town knows the judge is away settling his brother's estate. Jackson hung the bridle on a peg. Vernon's trying to discourage you from pursuing this. Hope flickered within Lillian. Then the deed might be valid after all. It's possible. We'll need to wait for the judge's return to know for certain. Jackson hesitated, then added, in the meantime, your position here is secure for as long as you need it. The genuine kindness in his voice touched Lillian deeply. Thank you, Jackson, for everything. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch as had become their custom. The August air was warm, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Lillian found herself studying Jackson's profile in the fading light, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, even when he wasn't fully smiling. What will you do if the deed proves valid? He asked, breaking the companionable silence. Lillian considered the question. I'm not entirely sure. Selling seems the most practical option. I have no desire to live there alone, and I certainly couldn't manage the property without help. It would give you options, Jackson acknowledged. You could return east if you wished. Or perhaps start a small business in town. And what would you do without a housekeeper? Lillian asked, surprised by the teasing note that had entered her voice. Jackson turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. I managed before you came, Mrs. Turner. Poorly, as I recall telling you, but I managed. You did indeed tell me that, Lillian agreed, smiling faintly. And I believe I've seen evidence of your management in the condition of those curtains when I arrived. A low chuckle escaped him. The curtains were the least of my domestic failures. Their laughter faded into another comfortable silence, but something had shifted between them, a new awareness that Lillian wasn't entirely prepared to examine. August melted into September, bringing cooler evenings and the golden hues of autumn to the Wyoming landscape. Judge Patterson returned from Denver, and Jackson arranged for Lillian to meet with him privately regarding the deed. The judge's office in town was a small, book-lined room that smelled of leather and pipe tobacco. He examined the document carefully, asking Lillian several questions about when and how she had acquired it. This appears to be a legitimate deed transfer, he finally declared, setting down his spectacles. The signatures are proper, the witnesses are respected townspeople, and the property description is accurate. Lillian's heart leapt. So it's valid. Valid in content, yes, the judge said cautiously. However, Vernon Blackwell is technically correct about one thing without having been filed with the county clerk. This document has no legal standing. But it proves Thomas's intention, Jackson argued from his position near the window. And it proves Vernon lied about never transferring ownership. Judge Patterson nodded slowly. It certainly raises questions about Vernon's truthfulness, but from a strictly legal standpoint, Mrs. Turner, I'm afraid this deed alone won't secure you the property. What would it take? Lillian asked, determined not to give up so easily. Testimony from the witnesses that Vernon actually intended to transfer the property, not just drafted a document. Evidence that Thomas took possession and acted as the legal owner, and of course, an explanation for why the deed was never filed. The judge sighed. It would mean a court battle against the most influential family in the county. Lillian's shoulders slumped slightly. I see. That said, the judge continued, this document might be valuable in negotiating a settlement. Vernon wouldn't want his reputation tarnished by evidence of underhanded dealings. Perhaps a financial compensation could be arranged. As they left the judge's office, Lillian felt a curious mixture of disappointment and relief. The prospect of a legal battle against the Turners was daunting, yet the idea of simply accepting Vernon's duplicity rankled. We could try speaking with the witnesses, Jackson suggested as they walked toward the general store where they'd left their wagon. See if they remember signing. Lillian nodded absently, her mind working through possibilities. Judge Patterson suggested negotiation might be more practical. Vernon doesn't negotiate, Jackson said grimly. He dictates terms. Perhaps, Lillian agreed, but even Vernon must care about his standing in the community. If word got out that he fabricated ownership claims to seize his dead son's property from his widow. Jackson stopped walking, a slow smile spreading across his face. Mrs. Turner, I believe you might have found Vernon Blackwell's one vulnerability. They drafted the letter that evening, Lillian's neat handwriting filling 2 pages with a carefully worded proposal. She outlined what she knew about the deed, named the witnesses, and suggested that a financial settlement equivalent to half the property's value would allow her to keep certain matters private. It was bold, perhaps even dangerous, but Lillian felt a newfound strength that surprised her. The response came 3 days later when Elias Turner appeared at Keller Ranch once again. This time, he dismounted and approached the house with measured steps, finding Lillian and Jackson sharing a late breakfast on the porch. Mrs. Turner, he said stiffly. My father has asked me to discuss your proposition. Jackson gestured to an empty chair. Join us, Turner. Coffee? Elias ignored the offer, remaining standing. Father is prepared to offer you $200 to settle all claims and return the document in question. Lillian nearly choked on her coffee. The sum was insultingly low, a fraction of what the property was worth. Your father misunderstands the nature of my proposal, Mr. Turner. I'm not seeking charity. $2,000 would be closer to a fair value, Jackson interjected calmly. The homestead is 80 acres of good grazing land with a habitable dwelling. Elias's face reddened. Father authorized me to go as high as $500, not a penny more, and he wants the matter settled today. Lillian set down her cup with deliberate care. Please inform your father that I'll need time to consider his offer. I'll also need to consult with Judge Patterson regarding the legal implications of such a settlement. The judge has no business in this family matter, Elias snapped. On the contrary, Jackson said, rising to his feet in a casual movement that nonetheless emphasized his height advantage over Elias. Since this concerns legal documents and property rights, the judge seems the exact person to consult. Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Turner? Absolutely, Lillian replied, finding it increasingly difficult to hide her satisfaction at Elias's obvious discomfort. Father won't take kindly to threats, Elias warned, backing toward his horse. Nor do I, Lillian called after him. Yet he saw fit to threaten me with homelessness while I was still in mourning. Perhaps you might remind him of that when you deliver my message. After Elias had galloped away, Jackson turned to Lillian with newfound respect in his eyes. I've never seen Elias Turner retreat so quickly. You found your backbone, Mrs. Turner. Lillian, she corrected him softly. After all this time, I think you might call me Lillian. His smile deepened, reaching his eyes. Lillian then, and I'm Jackson, not Mr. Keller, at least when we're not in company. That small intimacy, the exchange of first names after months of formal address, felt more significant than it should have. Lillian found herself noticing things about Jackson she'd previously overlooked. The careful way he always ensured her comfort, how he listened attentively when she spoke, the quiet strength he projected without dominance or intimidation. Vernon's next offer came through his lawyer, $800, and a written statement that Lillian would make no further claims against the Turner family. After consulting with Judge Patterson, who advised that this was likely the best outcome she could expect without a lengthy court battle, Lillian accepted. The day she signed the settlement papers in the lawyer's office, with Jackson standing witness, felt like closing a chapter of her life. Thomas Turner and their brief marriage now seemed like a distant memory, important, but no longer defining her present or future. "What will you do with the money?" Jackson asked as they drove back to the ranch, the bank draft safely tucked in Lillian's handbag. "I've been thinking about that," she replied, watching the familiar landscape roll past. "I could return east, as we discussed before, or perhaps open a small shop in town." Jackson nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Both sound like fine options." Lillian studied his profile, gathering her courage. "There's a third possibility I've been considering." "Oh," his tone was casual, but his hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "I could invest in a partnership, a ranch, perhaps. One that's already established but could expand with additional capital." She paused, heart hammering. "Your north pasture could support twice the cattle it currently does with proper development." Jackson turned to look at her, surprise evident in his features. "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Lillian?" "I'm proposing a conversation about possibilities," she clarified. "I've grown fond of ranching life. I've also grown fond of—" She hesitated, then finished simply, "this place." The wagon rolled to a stop as Jackson pulled on the reins. In the middle of the empty road, with the late afternoon sun casting long shadows around them, he turned to face her fully. "Lillian," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "if you're suggesting what I think you are, I should be clear about something. I didn't offer you employment with any expectations beyond the terms we agreed upon. I would never want you to feel obligated or—" "Jackson," she interrupted gently, "do I strike you as a woman who acts from obligation rather than choice?" A smile tugged at his lips. "No. Quite the opposite, in fact." "Then allow me to be perfectly clear," Lillian continued, her confidence growing. "I'm not suggesting a business partnership because I feel obligated. I'm suggesting it because I've come to care for you and because I believe we work well together, in all ways." Jackson's eyes searched hers for a long moment. "I've been careful not to speak of my feelings out of respect for your grieving. But if you're ready to hear it, I should tell you that I began falling in love with you somewhere between the first properly cooked meal and watching you face down Vernon Blackwell without flinching." Joy bloomed in Lillian's chest, warm and expansive. "I think I began falling in love with you the day you stood beside me in church, making it clear to everyone that I wasn't alone." Jackson reached for her hand, his touch gentle but certain. "You haven't been alone since that day, and you never will be again if I have any say in the matter." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Keller?" Lillian asked, a teasing lilt in her voice despite the seriousness of the moment. "It's the beginning of one," he replied, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'd like to do it properly, perhaps not on a dusty road in a wagon that needs new springs." Lillian laughed, the sound carrying across the open prairie. "I've never been particularly concerned with propriety, but I appreciate the sentiment." Jackson leaned forward, his intent clear, and Lillian met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more certain. When they finally pulled apart, Lillian felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, the last vestiges of grief making way for the promise of new happiness. The following Sunday, they attended church together as usual, though this time Jackson kept Lillian's hand firmly in his as they entered the building. The gesture wasn't lost on the congregation, and Lillian noted with satisfaction the look of consternation on Vernon Blackwell's face when they passed his pew. After the service, several of the neighboring ranchers' wives approached Lillian with warm congratulations. though no formal announcement had been made. News traveled quickly in small communities, and the change in relationship between the widowed housekeeper and her employer had evidently been obvious to everyone except perhaps the couple themselves. "Mrs. Peterson takes full credit, you know," Jackson murmured as they walked to their wagon. "Told me this morning she'd known we were perfect for each other from the start." Lillian smiled, remembering the elderly woman's matchmaking efforts. "She saw possibilities I couldn't see through my grief." "She's a wise woman," Jackson agreed. "Though I'd appreciate if you didn't tell her I said so. Her satisfaction is unbearable enough already." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual that had evolved from employer and employee sharing polite conversation to something far more intimate, Jackson reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this for 3 days, waiting for the perfect moment," he admitted, turning the box in his hands. "But I'm beginning to think there's no such thing as perfect timing, only the courage to speak one's heart when it's ready." He opened the box to reveal a ring not ostentatious, but beautifully crafted, with a single diamond flanked by 2 smaller sapphires. "It was my mother's," Jackson explained. "My father saved for 2 years to buy it for her." Lillian's breath caught as he took her hand. "Lillian Turner, I know we've come to this place through unconventional circumstances. You arrived at my door seeking employment and shelter, not love. But in these months together, you've become essential to my happiness in ways that go far beyond a well-kept house or a properly cooked meal." His blue eyes held her steadily. "I'm offering you my name, my land, and most importantly, my heart if you'll have them." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes to all of it." The ring slid onto her finger as though it had been made for her. Jackson pulled her into his arms, his kiss more certain now, filled with promise and passion that spoke of their future together. Their wedding took place in October, when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter. The ceremony was held at Keller Ranch, with Judge Patterson officiating and neighbors from miles around in attendance. Mrs. Peterson beamed throughout the proceedings, occasionally wiping tears of satisfaction from her eyes. The Turners were notably absent, though Lillian had insisted on sending them an invitation. "Not because I expect or even want them to attend," she'd explained to Jackson, "but because I want them to know that their attempts to break me failed completely." As Lillian spoke her vows in the clear autumn sunlight, wearing a new dress of ivory silk ordered from Denver, she reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment. She had come west as a mail-order bride, seeking security in a marriage of convenience. She had been widowed, dispossessed, and forced to rebuild her life from nearly nothing. Yet somehow, through all the hardship, she had found something precious and rare, a love based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. As Jackson slipped a gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that this marriage was different from her first. This was a true partnership, freely chosen by both. The celebration continued well into the evening, with tables set up in the yard, lanterns hanging from tree branches, and a fiddler playing lively tunes that had even the most dignified ranchers tapping their feet. When the last guests had departed, Jackson led Lillian up to their bedroom, no longer his alone, but now properly theirs. "Mrs. Keller," he said, the new name sounding right on his lips. "Welcome home," Lillian smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "I've been home since the day you brought me here, Jackson. I just didn't realize it until now." In the years that followed, Keller Ranch flourished under their joint stewardship. Lillian's settlement money went toward expanding the herd and improving the north pasture, just as she had suggested. Jackson's knowledge of cattle and land management, combined with Lillian's sharp mind for business, created a partnership that was the envy of neighboring ranchers. Their first child, a daughter named Eleanor, arrived a year after their wedding, followed 2 years later by a son they called William. The house that had once felt too large for a bachelor became filled with the sounds of family life, children's laughter, occasional squabbles, and the constant bustle of a home where love was the foundation. Vernon Blackwell died during a harsh winter 3 years after Lillian and Jackson's marriage. His funeral was well attended, though more out of obligation than genuine grief. The Turner brothers divided the property and promptly began squabbling over boundaries and water rights, their father's iron control no longer keeping them in check. One crisp autumn afternoon, 5 years into their marriage, Lillian found Jackson sitting on the porch, watching their children play with a wooden train set he had carved for them. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him and resting her head against his shoulder. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out," he replied, his arm coming around her automatically. "If Mrs. Peterson hadn't suggested I hire you if you'd returned east instead, or if Thomas hadn't died," Lillian added quietly. She had long since come to terms with her first husband's death, able now to acknowledge it without pain. "Life takes strange turns," Jackson nodded, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I can't help but be grateful for the path that brought you to me, though I'd never wish hardship on you." "The hardship made me stronger," Lillian said simply. "And it led me here to this life we've built together. I wouldn't change a moment of it." As the afternoon sun bathed the ranch in golden light, Lillian watched her children playing, secure in the knowledge that they would inherit not just land and cattle, but a legacy of resilience, integrity, and love. From a mail-order bride to a widow cast out by her husband's family, to a beloved wife and respected rancher's partner, her journey had been unexpected, but the destination was more fulfilling than she could have ever imagined. Jackson's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of long partnership. "I love you, Lillian Keller," he said, the words no less meaningful for having been spoken countless times before. "And I love you," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come." The Wyoming sun continued its slow descent toward the distant mountains, painting the landscape in the warm hues of autumn. On Keller Ranch, a family that had been forged through loss, courage, and love watched the days end together, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the frontier might bring, they would face them as they had faced all others side by side, stronger together than they could ever be apart.